The Senate will come to order. The chaplain will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal Spirit, our lamp and light, we praise your holy name. Lord, you are our strength and shield, enabling us to be sure-footed even when standing on mountain heights. Stay with our lawmakers. Support them with your mighty hand and keep their feet from slipping. Enable our senators to one day stand before your presence with great joy. Show them your greatness until the things of earth grow strangely dim in the light of your glory and grace. We pray in your majestic name. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., February 8, 2018. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Patrick J. Toomey, a senator from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Orrin G. Hatch, President pro tempore.
Excuse me, Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
This Congress and this President have delivered an historic series of achievements for the American people. We took an axe to the red tape holding back our economy. We used the Congressional Review Act a record 15 times to pave the way for job creation. After years of broken promises to our veterans, we delivered VA reform legislation to begin giving our heroes the more accessible care, greater choice, and workforce training they deserve. We confirmed outstanding judges to the federal bench. We advanced efforts to address the opioid crisis. And of course, we passed the most significant tax overhaul in a generation. Already, tax reform is increasing take-home pay for American workers. Already, businesses are investing more, expanding more, and creating more good-paying jobs right here at home. Over the past year, we've built a record of successes for middle-class families and a stronger, safer country. But among all the work that still remains, one critical piece of unfinished business is now really close to the finish line. If we act now, we can start rebuilding our military and provide our troops the training and equipment they need to defend the homeland and protect the American people. The crisis in our military is acute. Just this week, headlines reveal that two-thirds of the Navy's FA-18 aircraft are not prepared to fly. The fleet, which must secure sea lines of communication across the globe and patrol the Persian Gulf and the South China Sea, has shrunk to the smallest ship count in nearly 3 decades. We've become too reliant on special operations forces and radically drawn down our conventional force structure. This has not been lost on China or Russia. They're improving their conventional forces and intimidating their neighbors. Our force faces a complex collection of threats and challenges from Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea to ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates. The need for our forward presence is not diminished in the Persian Gulf, nor in the South China Sea and the wider Pacific. Neither has our responsibility to our NATO allies in Europe or to the Republic of Korea. No, we have not asked our all-volunteer military to do any less for our country. They've just been forced to make do with less. And all these short-term funding bills have handicapped our military leaders' ability to make long-term plans and investments. In December, the Navy Secretary said the inefficiencies from continuing resolutions have cost his department enough money to pay for an entire squadron of fighter planes or 2 destroyers. Let me say that again. Secretary of the Navy said the inefficiencies from continuing resolutions have cost his department enough money to pay for an entire squadron of fighter planes or 2 destroyers. Here's how General Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, put it. He said the U.S. military's competitive advantage against potential adversaries is eroding. Yesterday, I announced a bipartisan budget agreement that will finally bring this to a close. The agreement will allow for the funding levels recommended by the NDAA conference report, authorization levels secured by the stalwart leadership of Chairman John McCain and our colleagues on the Armed Services Committee. So what does this mean for our men and women in uniform? It means putting a stop to the decline in combat readiness. It means knowing their weapon systems will be delivered, maintained, and kept on the cutting edge. Take it from Secretary Mattis. Yesterday, he explained just what this agreement will do. Here's how he put it. It will ensure our military can defend our way of life, preserve the promise of prosperity, and pass on the freedoms you and I enjoy to the next generation. Our volunteer service members aren't the only Americans this agreement will help. It also builds on the progress we've made for veterans and military families by providing for better care and helping cut the VA's maintenance backlog. It offers reinforcements to families on the front lines of our nation's struggle with opioid addiction and substance abuse. According to the CDC, opioid overdose deaths increased 5-fold just between 1999 and 2016. On average, this epidemic takes more than 100 American lives every single day. This agreement provides for new grants, prevention programs, and law enforcement initiatives to bolster existing national and state efforts. And the legislation secures relief for families who are still struggling to rebuild in the wake of last year's spate of natural disasters. This provision was only made possible by tireless work from several of my colleagues. Thanks to the leadership of Senator Cornyn, to Senator Cruz's advocacy for Texas, and to Senator Rubio, who led on behalf of Florida and spoke up forcefully for the people of Puerto Rico, help will soon be on the way. And the agreement also provides for new investment in our nation's infrastructure, a shared bipartisan priority. Now, I'm confident that no senator on either side of the aisle believes this is a perfect bill. But I'm also confident this is our best chance to begin rebuilding our military and make progress on issues directly affecting the American people. This is a bill for brave Americans serving our country, including the many service members based in my home state of Kentucky. They deserve the pay raise we promised them and the confidence that when they leave our shores, they're combat ready. This is a bill for our distinguished military commanders who have sounded the alarm on sequestration more times than any of us can count. This is a bill for our heroes who've come home. They should be greeted by a better funded, streamlined Veterans Administration that is equipped to meet their needs. This is a bill for American families who've been victimized by brutal storms or the scourge of drug addiction. They deserve the assistance this agreement secures. I hope each senator will carefully review this bipartisan bill and support it. We need to build on our historic year, seize the opportunity, and keep moving forward.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the House message to accompany H.R. 695, which the clerk will report.
House message to accompany H.R. 695, an act to amend the National Child Protection Act of 1993 to establish a national criminal history background check system and criminal history review program for certain individuals who, related to their employment, have access to children, the elderly, or individuals with disabilities, and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, the time until 11:30 will be equally divided between the two leaders or their designees. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senate Minority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with. Are we in a quorum, Mr. President?
We are in a quorum call.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, yesterday, after months of painstaking negotiations, the Republican leader and I reached a 2-year budget deal. Not only will it end this series of successful fiscal crises that have gridlocked this body, it will also deliver a large investment in our military and robust funding of middle-class programs. It will also give a significant boost to our nation's health care and provide long overdue relief to disaster-stricken parts of our country. As I said yesterday, it doesn't include everything that Democrats want, nor everything that Republicans want. But it's a good deal for the American people, and it's a strong signal that we can break the gridlock that has overwhelmed this body and work together for the good of the country. Let me run through a few of the benefits that this agreement would provide. Our military has suffered from the uncertainty of endless short-term spending bills. This budget deal puts that to an end. It gives the military a significant boost in support and allows the Pentagon to make long-term decisions about its budget. It's the right thing to do, and I want to credit 2 people. First, my dear friend Senator McCain. He talked to me repeatedly, even when he was ill, about the need for funding defense. He also talked about the need for doing immigration and tried to make them go hand in hand. But Senator McCain has been our leader in this chamber on both sides of the aisle in terms of making sure defense is funded, and I know he is proud today of what we're doing for the military. I'd also like to thank Secretary Mattis. He visited me repeatedly. He's a cabinet secretary who seems to be doing his job rather than focusing on an ideological path which divides people, and he worked hard for this and deserves a great deal of credit. We Democrats always argued that we wanted to fund our military and our middle-class programs. We needed good help on both. A mother whose child died from opioid addiction, a veteran who's waiting in line to get help, college students with great debt on their shoulders, pensioners whose pensions might be greatly diminished. They all need help too. To say our military needs help to the exclusion of all these other worthy causes is not fair to them and not good for America. And I've always argued we can do both. This budget shows we can. We can do both, fund the military and help fund the middle class. And for those naysayers who said that couldn't be done, it sure can. In this budget, I'm proud of what it does for the middle class. For a decade, we all know this. We all talk about it. Our middle class has suffered from a needless and self-imposed austerity in Congress, limiting investments in jobs and education, infrastructure, scientific research, and more. This deal puts that to an end as well. So for those who said we can't do both, we can. I'm proud of this budget because it does. Let me go into a few specifics. There is billions of dollars of support for child care, helping middle-class families shoulder the very heavy burden of child care. They need to take care of their kids in a way that they can have confidence in when both parents work. So often that happens. Or in single-parent families. So often that happens. What about college affordability? The debt burden on the shoulders of those who just got out of college or graduate school is huge. We are focusing on providing help here. And this time, in this budget, we focus on police officers, teachers, and firefighters. What about infrastructure? Our infrastructure is crumbling throughout America. Much of it was built 50 or even 100 years ago. Roads and bridges, water and wastewater. We need to help those, and then we need new infrastructure. How about rural broadband to rural areas and inner cities which are not getting it? Broadband's a necessity today. Kids can't learn. Often you can't hold a job unless you can get broadband at home. Well, in large parts of America, particularly rural, you can't get it. We provide help, and rural America is very happy that we're doing this. We provide billions to rebuild and improve veterans' hospitals and clinics so that when our brave soldiers come home bearing the scars of war, their country serves them just as well as they served us. Opioids, I mentioned that earlier. $6 billion, finally, to guard against the opioid and mental health crises. The opioid crisis is widespread. The president has set up a whole bunch of commissions and given a whole bunch of speeches, but hasn't funded it. We in this body have. We Democrats have led the charge. We have so many members, like Senators Shaheen and Manchin, so many senators like Senators Heitkamp and Baldwin, so many senators like McCaskill and Donnelly, like Senator Hassan, have been talking about the opioid crisis for a long time, and their hard work has now produced the dollars that will give the treatment that so many who are addicted need and the infrastructure to prevent these bad drugs, particularly fentanyl, from coming into this country. Mr. President, my guest to the State of the Union was a woman named Stephanie Keenan from Putnam County. She was a brave mother of a veteran. The veteran got hooked on opioids in the depths of PTSD. He waited 16 months for his first appointment at the VA, died of an overdose 2 weeks before he could get treatment. Stephanie Keenan has been fighting for this. She's a brave, strong woman who's lighting a candle. She was my guest at the State of the Union. She's a happy woman this morning because all her hard work after her son's passing is coming to fruition. And of course, there's much more in this proposal, so much we can all be proud of as Americans, that we're not neglecting people who have been neglected for so long. Support for community health centers. They serve over 25 million Americans. A full decade of funding for CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program. An effort to lower prescription drug costs to millions of American seniors caught in the Medicare Part D donut hole. Disaster relief. Recovery funding not just for Texas and Louisiana and Florida, important as they may be and are, but for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands and western states. And a special select committee, we don't do this often, that's empowered under a deadline to deliver a legislative fix to the pension issue by the end of the year. This issue, which plagues so many working Americans, middle-class Americans, in many states, people who paid into their pensions day after day, week after week, month after month, and are now finding those pensions vanishing, we should provide relief for them, just as we should provide relief for others. And this commission is a strong, bright light that focuses on this issue and will create a path to solution. I want to salute so many of my colleagues who've worked so hard on so many of these pieces. Senators Murray and Wyden and Tester on health care. Brown, Casey, Stabenow, Manchin, Heitkamp, Donnelly, Klobuchar, Baldwin, and Smith on the pension piece. Nelson on the disaster package. Senator Leahy, ranking member of Appropriations, done a great job on the whole thing. A lot of credit is due to each of them and so many more of our members, because the final product is something that will benefit so many Americans over the next decade. Senator McCaskill was also very much involved in the pension issue, as well as many others. So I hope this budget agreement will pass the Senate in large numbers from both sides of the aisle. It'll be easy to say, well, I didn't like this, I didn't like that. But this is a time to come together. This is a time to stand up for our soldiers, our middle class, and those aspiring to the middle class. So I hope we will get a large bipartisan vote. And to that point, I have some pointed words for some in the House, in the Freedom Caucus, hard right, who are starting to squawk about this budget deal. They say it raises the deficit. They just voted and cheered a bill that would add $1.5 trillion to the deficit in the form of tax breaks for mammoth corporations. They were willing to increase the deficit on the defense side of the budget. But all of a sudden, When it comes to our schools or our roads or our scientific research, oh, we can't do it because of the deficit. Mr. President, it is blatantly hypocritical to ignore the deficit when it favors corporate America, but raise the alarm when it comes to helping our veterans, our students, those addicted to opioids. That is selective enforcement. That doesn't fly. And there's a lot of sophistry going on. Oh, well, when we reduce taxes, we won't have a deficit because it'll keep the economy growing. Does anyone doubt that education keeps the economy growing? That scientific research keeps the economy growing? That building infrastructure keeps the economy growing? There's a lot of hokum flying around here, that only when you cut taxes for big corporations we grow the economy. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. And I think Americans are tired of the hypocrisy on the hard right, which greets a $1.5 trillion hole in the deficit by cutting corporate taxes and primarily taxes on the wealthy with cheers, and then says you can't spend money for somebody who needs relief from the student debt loan they have, or needs help for health care or food stamps. It is utter, sheer hypocrisy. Let this budget go forward through both chambers and onto the President's desk, where President Trump seems willing and ready to sign. President Trump was not involved in this process. He was not constructive when he spoke and tweeted. He asked for a shutdown. I think in this body, and I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are learning this, that oftentimes we can get a lot more done working with one another and let the White House just sit on the sidelines, because you don't know what their positions are. As I once said, negotiating with the president's like negotiating with Jell-O, and oftentimes their positions are just so far over to one side of the political spectrum, sort of Koch brother type positions, that they'd never pass. So this is a good model. Now, one more word on immigration. Based on my continued conversations with the Republican leader, once we pass this budget agreement, we're ready to proceed to a neutral bill, shell bill, on immigration next week. And the leader has guaranteed, the Republican leader, an amendment process fair on all sides where we'll alternate amendments. That means some of the people who are on the very conservative side will get amendments, some on the very liberal side, but so will there be an opportunity for a bipartisan compromise focusing on the Dreamers and border security that has a real chance of getting 60 votes. We should all be working hard to get that done in this chamber. And I would say to my friends in America who care about the Dreamers, please let your senators know, particularly those senators who have not committed to helping the Dreamers, how important this is. Next week will be one of the most vital weeks that we can deal with the Dreamer issue in a fair, compassionate way. It's been swept under the rug for too long. But because of the agreement the leader and I came to a few weeks ago, that he has confirmed, keeping his commitment, we will be able to deal with it. Mr. President, the House should be able to deal with it as well. What Leader McConnell and I have agreed to should be something that Speaker Ryan agrees to. To just put President Trump's bill on the floor means no immigration bill and no help for the Dreamers. We all know that. It'll lose Republican votes as well as Democratic votes. It won't pass in the House. So I say to Speaker Ryan, allow a fair and open process to debate Dreamers on the floor of the House, just as we are allowing in the Senate. Leader Pelosi shouldn't have to stand and speak for 8 hours. I respect her for doing it, just to secure a vote on an issue as compelling and pressing as Dreamers. What Leader Pelosi is asking for is the same thing we got here in the Senate, no more, no less, a vote and an open process that is undeniably fair. So I hope Speaker Ryan will relent and promise a vote. There's an appetite on both sides and in both chambers to get this done. both helping the Dreamers and border security. In the Senate, I know that everyone on the Democratic side and many on the Republican side are working hard to find a bill that protects Dreamers and provides border security that can pass next week. We know this is a difficult task. We know immigration is one of the more volatile issues in America. But we have to do it for the good of this country. The budget was a difficult process. We came to an agreement. Let's do the same on immigration, a bipartisan agreement where each side gives some and we can all be proud that we got it done. The same effort and spirit that forged the budget deal should carry forward to the issue of Dreamers. Let's get it done next week. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana.
I ask unanimous consent to be recognized for up to 10 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I'd like to take a moment, Mr. President, to speak in support of two pieces of legislation I introduced that are included in the continuing resolution we'll vote on today. The Social Impact Partnerships to Pay for Results Act and the Modernizing the Interstate Placement of Children in Foster Care Act. Now, both of these bills are very important to Hoosiers, and I'm glad that we finally see them become law after 6 years of working in a bipartisan way to get them across the finish line. Let me tell you why these two measures are so important to Hoosiers and really to all Americans. The Social Impact Partnerships to Pay for Results Act empowers our public and private sectors to implement evidence-based social and public health interventions to address some of our nation's most pressing social challenges. Now, America has a celebrated and vibrant civil society. We have a history of not turning first to government to solve some of our thorniest social and public health challenges, but instead turning to our neighbors, turning to our local communities, perhaps our local not-for-profit groups or our community heroes. And we discover that oftentimes they are better situated to address these thorny challenges than government programs. That's not to suggest in the slightest that government doesn't have a very important role in addressing these broad social challenges. Government can indeed make a difference, but so can these other organizations. And we have a growing evidence base. This is without any partisan tinge to it. It is broadly agreed that we have a growing evidence base of those things that are working to address challenges like homelessness, to address things like asthma in low-income communities, to get the long-term unemployed back into the workforce. You name the social ill, and there is likely a not-for-profit group or even a for-profit group in each of our individual states which is making a meaningful difference on this front. So the challenge is, how do we scale up these evidence-based interventions in an era of scarce resources? Well, because social impact partnerships are focused on achieving results, taxpayer money is only paid out when desired outcomes are met. And government payments are made possible because when you really help somebody, when you really are able to help them achieve their goals and turn around their lives, that frees up government money. So we use those avoided costs, those future government savings, to pay back those who invest in scaling up things that really work to improve lives. Let me give you an example. One example of what has also been called pay for success. There's a service in Indianapolis that connects registered nurses with low-income pregnant women. The nurse-family partnership helps ensure both mom and baby are healthy throughout the pregnancy and through the infant's life. They hit specific metrics that save the federal government money. And under this legislation, a philanthropic organization like Indiana's Lilly Foundation could invest in the nurse-family partnership to scale up their work. As long as the metrics continue to be met, as long as success is achieved, the investor is paid a return out of those future government savings. Well, it makes a whole lot of sense, which is why it passed unanimously out of the House of Representatives previously, and why I believe it will be passed into law after passing this chamber and being signed into law by the President in coming days. Social impact partnerships address our moral responsibilities to ensure that social programs actually improve recipients' lives and do so in a fiscally prudent manner. They also respond to the imperative of improving our economic health by harnessing the capabilities of every able-bodied citizen. You know, we ought to be treating every American like they're an asset to be realized, not a liability to be written off, not a consumer of programs, but somebody with real potential. We want every American to achieve their full human potential. So to recap, who's going to benefit? Well, the recipients of these services through the public-private partnership will benefit. The least among us, taxpayers will benefit. Every American will benefit as our communities become strengthened, as more enter the workforce, as public health is improved, and so forth. Now, the next bipartisan measure, which I expect to get across the finish line today, is the Modernizing the Interstate Placement of Children in Foster Care Act. This bill expedites the time it takes to place children into loving homes. And we'll see why it's so important and so timely that we pass this legislation today as well. Thousands of children in my state of Indiana have lost loving parents to opioid addiction. I've seen it up close and personal. I used to represent Scott County, Indiana. This was ground zero in our state for the opioid epidemic. It made national news, not in a good way. So many good people have been adversely impacted in this community, and I know there are communities like this across the country that are being impacted to varying degrees by the opioid crisis. Well, I fear that if we do nothing, we'll lose thousands in the next generation as well. Modernizing the outdated interstate child placement process is one of a number of proposals that are urgently needed. This legislation will incentivize states to connect to an electronic interstate case processing system that has already achieved substantial reductions in the time it takes to place these children into homes. Now, frankly, before I dove into this, I just assumed that our foster care system was digitized, that it had found its way into the 21st century, that we weren't using paper files that were being mailed back and forth several times to process adoptions, especially under these very trying circumstances. But that's not the case. We need to make sure that for a child, they spend less time being shuffled from foster home to foster home. And this legislation will achieve that. We need to make sure that children who are taken in and out of school without a set routine, that situation is put to an end. For children caught up in a system struggling to meet community needs, we should do everything possible to get them immediately placed in the setting that's best for them, regardless of state boundary lines. So in summary, Mr. President, these bipartisan, bicameral bills were developed over 6 years. beginning during my time in the House of Representatives. I consulted with key stakeholders to make sure there would be broad support, and there is. And I had countless discussions with Hoosiers and other experts about how to tackle these challenges. The continuing resolution we'll vote on today isn't perfect. I remain concerned about our spending levels, and I maintain that we need to take long-term action for the fiscal health of our country. But with our commitment to our military and the inclusion of these two important pieces of legislation, I'll be voting for the CR for the good of all Hoosier children, families, and communities. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be recognized to speak for up to 10 minutes, followed by Senator Cardin for up to 10 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise to speak about the need to protect our dreamers from deportation. When we talk about dreamers, we are talking about immigrants who came to this country as children. We are talking about immigrants whose parents brought them here when they were young to give them a better chance than they had in their home countries. We are talking about young immigrants who, when they were children, had no choice in the decision to come to the United States. These dreamers know no other home than the United States, and many of them have spent their lives in limbo, identifying as Americans but lacking legal status and under the constant threat of being sent back to countries that are completely foreign to them. In 2012, President Obama took steps to protect some of these dreamers from deportation. Through an executive order, he established the program known as Daca, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program. DACA created security and opportunity for hundreds of thousands of young dreamers, allowing them to live and work in our great nation without the threat of deportation. So what DACA really stands for is Deserving a Chance in America. D-A-C-A, DACA. A protection for these innocent young people who deserved a shot at the American dream. And I would like to take a moment to speak about one of these Massachusetts dreamers who benefited from DACA. Her name is Estefany. She came to the United States at 9 years of age to escape violence in El Salvador. She was brought here by her grandmother along with her 2 sisters and a baby cousin. The journey took 22 days. It was arduous. Estefany was so scared, at one point she asked to be left behind. And when she finally got to the United States, she found it difficult to adjust to this whole new world. But Estefany was overjoyed to be reunited with her mother, who had come to the United States a few years before the rest of the family was able to come. Estefany was grateful for the opportunity she was given and did not want to squander it. She wanted to succeed in school and live up to her mother's sacrifice. Estefany, who only spoke Spanish when she arrived, struggled with elementary school, and she tried to do her homework every night. But working as hard as she could, in 2 years, she was moved on from her English as a second language class. Her hard work paid off even greater dividends when she was accepted into the prestigious Boston Latin Academy for high school. Her work ethic and desire to deserve her family's sacrifices were what motivated Estefany and got her through the many hardships that come with being undocumented: fear, uncertainty, and anxiety. When Estefany began her college application process, she fully understood for the first time what it meant to be undocumented. Although she wanted to go to college and have a career, she was afraid to tell her guidance counselor and teachers of her fears about her legal status. But once Estefany opened up to them, she confronted applying and attending college the same way she had always faced up to the other struggles in her life, with strength, with courage, and with perseverance. And she fought the battle that many aspiring college students wage, figuring out how to pay for it. It wasn't easy. As she researched and applied for scholarships, she found that most were for citizens only. But because of scholarships provided by immigrant support organizations like the wonderful Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, MIRA, Stephanie is now attending University of Massachusetts in Boston, where she is pursuing a degree in international relations and a minor in public policy. So it sounds like a happy ending, but sadly it is not. On Stephanie's first day as a freshman at UMass Boston, President Trump repealed Daca. He callously terminated the program with no guidance on what should be done next for these young dreamers. That heartless action by the president left Stephanie unable to focus on school. She no longer had any certainty about her future here in the United States and at UMass Boston. As Stephanie put it, quote, "After so many tears and sleepless nights, it felt like all my hard work was being thrown away." But Stephanie is a fighter, and she is not giving up on her college education or a career. I know she will succeed if she is just given a chance, because she, like so many other dreamers, deserved that chance. Over the 5 years that Daca was in effect, the program protected some 800,000 dreamers, nearly 8,000 in Massachusetts. These are young people like Stephanie, who study, who serve, who work, and who live next door to us every single day. They are our friends, our neighbors, and our loved ones. They are not too lazy. They are not bad hombres. They are some of the best and the brightest in our country. But now, because of President Trump's unconscionable decision to end Daca, Stephanie and so many young people like her are living in darkness again. It is heartbreaking to witness this administration strip protections away from people who are Americans in every way that should matter. Leaving them to live under a threat of deportation is unconscionable. We should not abandon these young people who we urge to come out of the shadows. We should not abandon the larger community of dreamers who have no other home than the United States. The American people understand this. In January, a poll found that 87% of Americans favor allowing immigrants who were brought to the United States illegally as children to be allowed to stay here. 87%, nearly all Americans, are with our dreamers. You would think extending these protections would be a no-brainer for the Republicans. Right here, right now, we could pass a bill to protect these young immigrants, but instead, the Republicans decided to use the dreamers as a bargaining chip in budget negotiations. They hope that by leveraging the lives and futures of dreamers, they will get their laundry list of hardliner immigration demands. So I am so glad that Senator McConnell has agreed with Senator Schumer that we're going to open up a debate here on the floor of the United States Senate. We are going to try to find a way of resolving this issue, although there's no guarantee that President Trump will, in fact, agree with any resolution here. There's no guarantee that the Tea Party, Freedom Caucus Republicans in the House of Representatives will agree with any understanding that is reached here on a bipartisan basis, if we can reach one on the floor of the United States Senate. So I just think, for better or worse, the dreamers should know that we are going to continue to fight for them, that we are going to continue to work towards creating a pathway for them to be able to live in our country without fear. And I think that's going to be the signature moment that we can create for our country this year. Yes, we have a budget agreement, but we have so much more work to do to help these great young people who will be great Americans once we create a path of citizenship for them. Mr. President, at this point, I would like to yield back.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, first I want to thank and concur in Senator Markey's comments in regards to the Dreamers. Yes, we are pleased that we have a bipartisan agreement today, and I'm still in the process of reading all the details before making a final judgment, but it's certainly good news that the Democrats, Republicans, the leadership has come together in an agreement. I joined Senator Markey and pleased that the majority leader is going to bring before the floor of the Senate in a fair manner next week the immigration issue. To protect the Dreamers, I would also add those in temporary protective status, TPS, should also be considered. We have a process, and I hope that the spirit that we've seen on the budget agreement will continue next week as the Senate works as it should in a bipartisan manner to protect the Dreamers and do what's right. But I also want to just acknowledge that there is no such commitment from the leadership, Republican leadership in the House. So I join with Leader Pelosi in urging Speaker Ryan to set up a similar process in the House so that we can get a bill to the President and signed into law to protect the Dreamers. The President created this problem by putting a date on their backs. It's our responsibility to respond in a timely way, and I'm glad to see the Senate is prepared to take action. Mr. President, I took this time because I want to talk about one specific provision in health care that was passed by Congress in the 90s. But let me just preface that by saying in this budget agreement, I'm pleased that there is bipartisan agreements on advancing health care in America. A bill that I've worked on since we imposed the therapy caps way back in the 90s that made no sense at all will finally correct that mistake permanently and allow those that are in need of therapy services, the most severe therapy services, those who have stroke victims or similar, to be able to get that care without a cap as to the amount of services that they need. I'm also pleased to see that we're going to be dealing with telemedicine, an issue that I've worked on, many members have worked on, improving dialysis treatment, some of the issues that we've all worked on, the community health centers, the Children's Health Insurance Program, 10-year extension, rural health care. There's a lot of good things in this bipartisan agreement to advance health care, and I'm pleased about it. But I just want to remind my colleagues that if we are successful in getting that enacted into law, we still got to make sure that it is implemented in the manner in which we intended. And I give as an example the prudent layperson standard on emergency medical treatment. I was involved in that process in the 1990s. And the reason this came to our attention is that insurance practices in the 1990s was such that it was not unusual for an insurance company to deny payment for emergency services. An individual would have the classic symptoms, for example, of a heart attack. The pain, the sweating, and did what a prudent layperson would do. Went to the nearest emergency room to get treatment. Well, after the examination was complete, they found out the person did not have a heart attack. The person was discharged from the hospital, went home a few days later, got the bill for that visit, and then almost had a heart attack when the insurance company would not pay for that bill. Well, we recognize that as not being right, so we took action to change that. In response to these dangerous and unfair requirements, Maryland enacted the prudent layperson standard in 1992. It was prudent to go to the emergency room for care. The insurance company had to reimburse it. Later in 1997, I led the national effort to extend the prudent layperson standard to all Medicare plans and Medicaid managed care plans as part of the Balanced Budget Act of 1997. I worked with President Clinton, who eventually signed an executive order in 1998 to have the standard applied to all government insurance programs. Then I fought to have my Patients' Bill of Rights Amendment, which included the prudent layperson standard, enacted as part of the Patients' Protection and Affordable Care Act for individual and group health plans. So we now have it effective for all plans in this country. And there's a definition of what is emergency medical conditions and what is a prudent to do that. It's spelled out in the statute dealing with the seriousness of the symptoms as it could deal with bodily harm, etc. But despite the federal law, private insurers are once again using tactics to prevent people from seeking care in an emergency room. Several newspapers, from the Los Angeles Times to the Columbia Dispatch, have reported that Anthem, one of the nation's largest insurers, has implemented an avoidable emergency room program to reduce what it deems as unnecessary ER visits and address rising health care costs. This program has been rolled out in several states, including Kentucky, Missouri, Ohio, Indiana, Georgia, and New Hampshire. According to these news reports, patients believing they have emergency symptoms go to the ER, for emergency medical care. After several tests, the physicians and nurses determined there's no emergency medical condition. The patient returns home relieved that they are okay. A few weeks later, they receive a letter from the insurance company refusing to cover the care received in the hospital. This is wrong. We said it was wrong in the 1990s. We took steps to change that. We now have laws that make it very clear. The Anthem avoidable ER policy forces people who are in some sort of acute distress to determine before they even leave their homes if their symptoms are really serious enough to go to emergency rooms. What we had back in the 1990s was pre-authorization for emergency care. Can you imagine trying to make a phone call before you go to an emergency room to talk to somebody as to whether you should go there or not, wasting valuable time? Or told to go to a different hospital than the closest hospital, again, causing real serious jeopardies? That's what we had. People should not be forced to act as their own doctors and second-guess themselves when they truly believe they are having a medical emergency. A wrong decision based upon economic considerations, the ability to pay the bill, could be deadly. We should not discourage people from seeking necessary medical treatment, and we should not allow insurance companies to return to the time when they could callously refuse to cover emergency care provided to individuals who genuinely and reasonably believe they need it. So, Mr. President, as we will be considering shortly additional improvements in our healthcare system to eliminate the cap that we have on therapy caps, to make it clear that we want to make telemedicine more available to help dialysis patients, to deal with our children with the Children's Health Insurance Program, to deal with rural health care. Let us also make sure that we set up the ability to make sure that our policies, in fact, are carried out. And we should not allow an insurance company such as Anthem to act as if what Congress did not exist. I think that is our responsibility. I look forward to working with our colleagues in a bipartisan way to improve the health care and access to all Americans. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
The motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 695, a bill to amend the National Child Protection Act of 1993, and so forth, and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
Is there objection? Without objection. By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 695 shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. King, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Resch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Cassidy, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, Ernst, Gardner, Grassley, Isaacson, Johnson, Kennedy, Langford, Murkowski, Rubio, Sass, Sullivan, Tillis. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Brown, Cardin, Coons, Heinrich, Leahy, Merkley, Stabenow, Whitehouse. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Udall, no. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Peters, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Perdue, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Manchin, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, aye. Ms. Harris. Ms. Harris, no. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, no. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Blake. Mr. Blake, no. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Flake, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye.
Any members in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 55, the nays are 44. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. The motion is not agreed to. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I move that the chair lay before the Senate the message to accompany H.R. 1892.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. Clerk will report.
House message to accompany H.R. 1892, an act to amend Title IV United States Code to provide for the flying of the flag at half-staff in the event of the death of a first responder in the line of duty.
Mr. President.
President Pro Tem.
Mr. President, is it proper to speak today as in morning business?
Without objection. The Senate will be in order.
Hey, Mr. President, I rise today to speak in strong support of the Bipartisan Budget Act, which the Senate will hopefully pass later today. Now, this bill, as the name implies, is the result of some rigorous bipartisan and bicameral negotiations. I'm pleased to have played a part in this endeavor, and I'm gratified to note that in addition to keeping
It will be in order.
I'm gratified to note that in addition to keeping the government open and providing much-needed resources for our troops, the bill before us addresses a number of longstanding priorities of the Senate Finance Committee, including many that I have personally been working toward for years now. Indeed, this legislation, once passed and signed into law, will be the culmination of years of work put in by members of the Finance Committee on both sides of the aisle. I want to take some time to say a few words about some of the bipartisan victories that will be achieved through this legislation. I should warn you, though, Mr. President, this will take a few minutes because there are quite a few provisions to discuss. For starters, let's just talk about health care. Among the more prominent victories in this bill is an extension of the Children's Health Insurance Program for an additional 4 years. As we all know, last month Congress passed a historic 6-year CHIP extension, which was eventually signed into law. The bill before us would add another 4 years on top of that 6-year provision, providing a total extension of 10 years. 10 years. That's just remarkable. I have a long history with the CHIP program, Mr. President. I was the original author of the program and have always been an outspoken champion of it. We've had some back and forth here in the Senate about CHIP in recent months, and some of it has gotten pretty fierce. However, today the Senate will pass legislation, bipartisan legislation, to provide unprecedented security and certainty for the families that depend on CHIP and the state governments that need more predictability to map out their own expenditures. I'm sure my friend, former Senator Kennedy, is up there watching and very happy that he came on this bill in the early stages and helped to put it through. In addition to the CHIP extension, the budget bill includes a bipartisan Finance Committee bill entitled the Creating High-Quality Results and Outcomes Necessary to Improve Chronic Care Act of 2017, a fairly long title. Senator Wyden, the Finance Committee's ranking member, and I have been working for years on this legislation, which, once enacted, will improve health outcomes for Medicare beneficiaries living with chronic conditions. It will also help bring down Medicare costs and streamline care coordination services. We've been working with our colleagues, stakeholders, and advocates for quite some time. We moved the bill through the committee last year, and the Senate actually passed it once already without a single vote in opposition. This legislation will finally get the Chronic Care Act to the President's desk. I want to thank Senator Wyden for the time and effort he's put into this effort. I also want to thank our other colleagues on the Finance Committee, particularly Senators Isaacson and Warner, who joined us on a working group to develop this important legislation and move it forward. This bill, as promised, will relieve a great deal of suffering for Medicare beneficiaries and will do so in a fiscally responsible manner. The budget bill also contains a package of bipartisan provisions that have come to be known as Medicare and health extenders. These provisions are high priorities for a number of our members throughout the Senate, and I am very pleased that we were able to include them in the final package of the spending bill. And while these are all important, I'd like to highlight that there are a few provisions that we were able to permanently resolve and not just extend. One such provision will repeal a flawed limit on the amount that Medicare would pay for outpatient physical and other therapy that threatened access for some of the most vulnerable patients. I worked with other members in both chambers to find a lasting solution to this decades-old problem, again, demonstrating that Congress can tackle hard problems and not just kick the can down the road. In addition to the Medicare extenders, the bipartisan funding bill also includes some key reforms to the underlying Medicare programs. These include expanding access to in-home treatments for patients with Medicare Part B and improve means testing for the premiums paid by high-income earners under Medicare Parts P and D, all of which will help improve the overall fiscal outlook for Medicare. Furthermore, the bill repeals the Independent Payment Advisory Board that was created under the so-called Affordable Care Act. This, too, is a step that has garnered bipartisan support, as it should, showing that many Democrats have joined Republicans in recognizing just how ill-advised the creation of this panel really was. The bill addresses a number of other health care priorities as well, including continued funding for various public health programs, some delays for burdensome Medicaid reductions that have been on the horizon, and it provides relief to Puerto Rico's health care challenges faced after the hurricane devastation by increasing Medicaid funding. I'd also like to say, Mr. President, in any big package, there are a lot of policies in here that give me concern. Some of the offsets, particularly related to Medicare Part D, that my Democratic colleagues insisted being in this package, are very troubling to me. And I look forward to working with my colleagues to address this moving forward. In addition to these health care priorities, the funding bill extends a number of important tax provisions in order to help families, individuals, and small businesses throughout the country. We made progress on producing and passing tax extenders legislation with the passage of the PATH Act in 2015. Still, many more important items remain to be handled, and we have worked to address member priorities to extend certain provisions. The provisions included in the spending bill all expired at the end of 2016. This legislation will extend them through this year. Finally, the bill takes some major steps forward in the area of human services, which is also under the jurisdiction of the Finance Committee. In addition to continuing funding for important child and family services programs, the bill includes the Family First Prevention Services Act, another bill originally introduced by Senator Wyden and myself to strengthen families and reduce inappropriate foster care placements. This legislation will help keep more children safely with their families instead of placing them with foster care. Under this bill, states will be able to fund effective services that have been shown to prevent children from entering foster care. It will also encourage states to place children with foster families instead of in-group homes, and it will reduce the bureaucracy faced by relatives who seek to take in children rather than have them end up in foster care. Also included in the spending bill is the Social Impact Partnership Act, a bill that I introduced along with Senator Bennett, which will support innovative public-private partnerships to address critical social and public health challenges. As a result of this bill, states will identify key social challenges they want to address, state the results they hope to achieve, and the federal government will pay for a rigorous, independent evaluation to verify that they achieve the outcome. Mr. President, as you can see, we've been very busy in the Finance Committee for the past few years. Obviously, we've seen success in some of the more high-profile items like tax reform late last year, as well as long-term highway funding and renewing Trade Promotion Authority in 2015. But our work has gone far beyond these efforts. And thankfully, with passage of this spending bill, many more of the committee's efforts, virtually all of them, bipartisan, will come to fruition. I want to thank the Senate leaders from both parties who have worked with us to include all of these important provisions. I want to thank my colleagues on the Finance Committee, both Republicans and Democrats, who have put in so much time over the years on all of these efforts, and congratulate them all for the success we look forward to seeing this week. Of course, Mr. President, we do still have to pass the bill. Therefore, I urge all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote in favor of this bipartisan legislation. And with that, I yield the floor.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, before I make my remarks, let me just say that in the what we might call the current unpleasantness in Washington, what a pleasant thing it is to be here on the Senate floor and hear the respected chairman of the Senate Finance Committee say the positive words that he has said, describe his success at expanding CHIP, and call to our memory the name of Senator Kennedy, who was his friend and his ally in creating that program upon which so many children across America depend. So I thank him for a lovely moment in an otherwise somewhat, should we say, challenging Washington environment. Mr. President, Mr. President,
Senator from Rhode Island.
in the spirit of back and forth, which is often the spirit of the Senate, I am following Senator Hatch, but I see Senator Wicker also on the floor. If time is pressing on him, I'd be willing to consider yielding for a few moments. I don't know how much time he intends to consume.
The senator is very kind, and time is not that pressing, and I'm actually expecting 2 or 3 colleagues, and perhaps we'll engage in a colloquy after that. So I do appreciate my friend's courtesy.
Well, in that event, let me commence my 196th Time to Wake Up climate speech. The last year has been a lousy one for environmental policy here in the United States. While the rest of the world began implementing the Paris Agreement to reduce the carbon emissions that are changing our climate and our oceans, this proud body, the United States Senate, sat on its hands. When President Trump handed the keys to his administration over to what I call the 3 stooges of the fossil fuel industry, Pruitt, Perry, and Zinke, the Senate sat on its hands. The recent interview with British journalist Piers Morgan shows Trump willing to make a scientific fool of himself on the question of climate change, to please the general managers pulling the strings of his administration, the Koch brothers. This record puts them all way out of line with most Americans. Overwhelming numbers of younger Americans demand climate action and plan to hold politicians who stand in its way accountable. Faith groups, universities, state and local governments, and businesses have stepped up their climate leadership. Businesses hear from their customers and know the American people want action. But if corporate America is serious about climate action in Washington, corporate America needs to explain why the big business lobby groups in this town, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Petroleum Institute, the National Association of Manufacturers, stand so resolutely in the way of climate action. These 3 industry groups have been instrumental in blocking climate action, using lobbying, dark money election spending, and threats of dark money election spending. Today, I want to take a look at the biggest and swampiest of the 3, the so-called U.S. Chamber of Commerce. First, let's clear up some common misperceptions about the Chamber. It is not a government agency, and it bears almost no relation to your hometown Chamber of Commerce. Instead of representing the interests of small businesses, the Chamber represents the interests of giant corporations international corporations, and the ultra-rich. Chamber President Tom Donahue admitted as much in a letter to the tobacco company Philip Morris. He wrote that small businesses provide the foot soldiers and often the political cover for issues big companies want pursued, end quote. Why this service to giant corporations and the ultra-rich? Easy answer. They pay the bills. The vast majority of the Chamber's $275 million per year budget comes from just a handful of donors. For instance, in 2014, just 119 donations accounted for over $160 million of the Chamber's fundraising haul. Who are these donors? Well, the Chamber doesn't want you to know. It does all it can to resist transparency. But thanks to voluntary disclosures by some corporations and the tax filings of some nonprofit groups, we know that its donors include many of America's biggest corporations, as well as political front groups run by the billionaire Koch brothers and Karl Rove. The Chamber took in at least $5.5 million from Koch-backed groups between 2012 and 2014. And a Karl Rove-affiliated group gave the Chamber $5.25 million in 2014 alone. It would be interesting to know how much of the Karl Rove money is actually Koch money laundered through the Karl Rove front group. What does the Chamber do with all this money? It lobbies, it litigates, and it runs political attack ads on television, radio, and the internet. Let's start with the lobbying. The Chamber spends far more than anyone else lobbying the federal government. It spent more than $80 million last year alone, far more than any individual company. Over the last 20 years, the Chamber has spent more than $1.4 billion. $1.4 billion, that's billion with a B, and the 9 zeros after it, lobbying the federal government. That is 3 times more than the next largest lobbying spender. A swamp monster indeed. Much of this lobbying is against environmental policies, with the Chamber lobbying Congress, the White House, EPA, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Interior on behalf of, yes, you guessed it, fossil fuel companies. The Chamber champions the fossil fuel agenda, opposing limits on carbon emissions and supporting drilling and mining on public lands and in offshore waters. The Chamber champions only the fossil fuel energy agenda, attacking renewable energy, despite that industry, the renewable industry, being responsible for more jobs than the fossil fuel industry. In 2016, for instance, the Chamber lobbied the federal government on at least 14 separate issues in favor of the oil and gas industry, and on at least 7 issues in favor of the coal industry. On renewable energy, 0, not 1. It was the Chamber that paid for the debunked study claiming the Paris Agreement would kill jobs and weaken economic growth, which Trump cited as justification for withdrawing from that agreement. The Chamber also spends a lot of effort importuning the courts. In a recent 3-year period, the Chamber was involved in roughly 500 cases as either a plaintiff or an amicus curiae, an interested party deemed a friend of the court. Once again, the Chamber fronted for the fossil fuel industry. In just 3 years, it sued EPA 15 times and filed amicus briefs against EPA in another 11 cases, making EPA the Chamber's most frequent target in court. The Chamber sued against the Clean Power Plan and has consistently opposed EPA's authority to regulate carbon emissions under the Clean Air Act. The Chamber also wrote an amicus brief urging the Supreme Court to strike down limits on election spending. It got its wish in the Citizens United decision. Citizens United allowed dark money groups, outside groups, to spend unlimited sums corrupting our elections. And the Chamber and the fossil fuel industry have been the biggest beneficiaries, the biggest users of this horrible decision. Over the last 10 years, the Chamber has spent more than $150 million in dark money on federal elections. And we don't know how much it's spent on state elections, other than we know it's contributed millions to other outside spending groups that are active at the state level. In 2016, the Chamber was the largest dark money spender in congressional races, often running vicious attack ads in races across the country. Many of these ads supported the fossil fuel agenda. Here's one from the 2016 Senate race in Pennsylvania. The Chamber was, again, the largest dark money spender on this race, spending over $6 million. It ran a series of attack ads against Katie McGinty, slamming her for supporting legislation to reduce carbon emissions. Here's the ad. A couple of moms are watching their kids. The kids are playing in the playground. One is complaining that McGinty supports taxing energy from fossil fuels, and the other mom remarks how much energy their kids have, to which the first reply is that, oh, if McGinty finds out about that, she'll tax the kids. Right on cue, McGinty, an actor supposed to represent the candidate, arrives, of course in a chauffeured black sedan, ready to tax the energetic kids. The ad ends with one mother screaming at her son Jimmy to run away. So that's what we get. The Chamber as the enforcer for the fossil fuel industry. Dare to support climate action or oppose fossil fuel interests, and the Chamber will come after you with everything it has. But it's actually worse than that, because there is one thing more insidious than spending millions of dollars on attack ads, and that is the threat of spending millions of dollars of attack ads. You see, once Citizens United allowed the Chamber and other outside election spending groups to spend unlimited funds, the corollary was that they could threaten to spend those unlimited funds. All the Chamber and other outside election spending groups now have to do is threaten to fund a challenger in order to bring many candidates and elected officials to heel. This Citizens United sanctioned intimidation explains why we can't make good climate policy in Washington, and the Chamber is its leading proponent. Several big American companies have stopped funding the Chamber over its anti-climate agenda. Apple, PG&E, Costco, Hewlett-Packard, Starbucks, Mars, and others have all left. Yet, plenty of other corporate climate champions still fund the Chamber. Unbelievable, but true. Here's an ad run last spring by several big companies urging Trump to stay in the Paris Agreement. These companies, Facebook, Gap Incorporated, Google, Intel Corporation, Microsoft, Morgan Stanley, and Salesforce, signed this full-page ad supporting the Paris Agreement. At the same time, they were donors to the Chamber, which was out attacking the Paris Agreement. How do you publicly support the Paris Agreement while funding the swamp monster attacking the Paris Agreement? The Trump administration is also seeking to cut funding for renewable energy research by 72%. America's business leaders should want to maintain U.S. technological leadership and create millions of high-paying clean energy jobs in the future. But the Chamber's Global Energy Institute, so-called, website is promoting Keystone XL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, and offshore drilling. I kid you not, offshore drilling. Facebook, Gap, Google, Intel, Microsoft, Morgan Stanley, Salesforce, Offshore drilling? What do you bet those companies don't take out full-page ads supporting offshore drilling? They do come to Washington to lobby. But when Facebook, Google, Intel, Microsoft, and Salesforce came to lobby Congress through their trade association, TechNet, they didn't even mention climate change. They didn't even make clean energy a priority. Instead, they fund the biggest, baddest opponent of climate action and clean energy. Why do companies so committed to increasing their own use of renewable energy not lobby Congress in favor of renewable energy? It's a battle here, folks. Where is the corporate cavalry? As long as pro-climate companies do nothing in Congress and allow fossil fuel front groups like the Chamber to be their voice here in Washington, how do they expect to make progress? The Chamber of Commerce they fund throws around hundreds of millions of dollars on lobbying and elections to ensure that Congress won't take the climate action they seek. What are Facebook, Gap, Google, Intel, Microsoft, Morgan Stanley, and Salesforce waiting for? Do they expect some kind of immaculate political conception of a climate bill? Climate action that suddenly floats magically down from the clouds? It's not like they don't lobby themselves. For Pete's sake, they know how the game is played. They just don't lobby for this. They just don't lobby for climate action. Look, good corporate policies on climate are important. They're very important. I get that, and I appreciate that. But we know well that good corporate policies won't reach those Paris climate goals. To reach those goals, you have to pass a bill. You've got to do something on climate here in Congress. And when the fossil fuel industry's blockade stopping such a bill is right here in Congress, this is the battlefield you got to show up on. It's great to take out ads. It helps. But it would really help to be present here in Congress and accounted for. Fighting for climate action in Washington is indispensable to finally break the stranglehold of the Chamber and its dark money allies. So please, corporate America, show up. I yield the floor.
Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to engage in a colloquy with my colleagues, Senator Casey and Senator Wicker.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today I rise with my colleagues, Senator Wicker from Mississippi, Senator Casey from the great state of Pennsylvania, to talk about legislation that's of vital importance, I believe, to every state in the country, certainly mine, the great state of Alaska, but most importantly, Mr. President, is vitally important legislation to the men and women who serve in the United States Coast Guard. And I'm going to talk about them for a minute. But in addition to the legislation we're talking about here, it's also vitally important to our maritime and fishing communities as well. So very important legislation. Which legislation am I talking about? Senate Bill 1129, the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2017. It is legislation that has broad bipartisan support, including Chairman Thune of the Commerce Committee, the ranking member of the Commerce Committee, Senator Nelson of Florida, my colleague from Alaska, Senator Lisa Murkowski, and many, many others, Republicans and Democrats. The Senate Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over the Coast Guard, and our fishing fleets, and our fisheries, marked up this important legislation back in May of 2017. But, Mr. President, unfortunately, due to a lack of an agreement on one particular provision, although we have very strong support even for this particular provision, over 60 senators, the Coast Guard bill overall remains stuck. So, we always talk about the Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines. I love them to death. Sometimes we forget about our fifth branch of service. And these men and women do incredible work every single day for our country. This bipartisan bill, the Coast Guard Authorization Act, will give the Coast Guard the resources it needs to protect our waterways and coastlines, block illegal drug traffickers and smugglers, more efficiently procure future Coast Guard cutters. It will authorize the Coast Guard in terms of policies and spending through fiscal years 2018 and 2019. And most importantly, Mr. President, it takes care of the men and women serving in our Coast Guard, who come from every state, hail from every state in our great nation. They do so much. So we're going to be debating here the continuing resolution that will have very, very significant funding for our military, but also for natural disasters. Well, think about the natural disasters that have occurred in the United States, in Florida, in Texas, in other places, Louisiana, in the last several months. The Coast Guard undertook thousands of rescue operations. Men and women risking their lives, literally risking their lives to save their fellow Americans. This bill focuses on them. And in constructing this legislation, we worked in a bipartisan manner for months. And however, Mr. President, it appears that the Coast Guard authorization bill unfortunately remains stuck. Now, I serve as the subcommittee, or as the chairman of the subcommittee responsible for the Coast Guard. And in Alaska, we know all about the men and women of the Coast Guard. I like to say prior to 9/11, the Coast Guard was probably the only military service among all 5 branches that had men and women out there risking their lives every single day for Americans. Now, unfortunately, since 9/11, and the big challenges we've had from a national security perspective, we have men and women in all branches of services out there every single day risking their lives. But the Coast Guard does it, at home and abroad. So, what's happening with this bill? Well, this bill, which again is very bipartisan, not only contains critical needs and authorizations and policies for our Coast Guard and the men and women who serve in it, it also contains provisions of vital importance to our maritime industry and fishing communities. Including in this legislation is important elements of another act, the Vessel Incident Discharge Act, or what we call VITA, to address an issue that has been around for years, which pertains to the incidental discharges for those in our fishing fleets and maritime fleets. So what does it try to address? Well, Mr. President, currently vessel owners and operators fishing in the maritime industry are forced to comply with a patchwork of burdensome federal and state regulations and laws for vessel ballast water and incidental discharges. Literally, discharges of water that come off the deck of your fishing vessel, for example. And think about it. When you think about the Constitution and the Commerce Clause, this is an issue where a fishing vessel, say, moves from different waters in the United States, state waters, from one state to another, or a maritime ship, one state to another. And it has to comply with a patchwork of different state laws and regulations as it moves through different waters controlled by different states. This creates inefficiencies, adds business costs, and particularly in the fishing fleet, inhibits economic prosperity for states and people in the industry, whether it's in Alaska or other places throughout the country. So the VITA provision that, again, we all worked on and has very strong bipartisan support would provide the maritime and fishing industry with a consistent, uniform regulatory structure across the country, restoring efficient and cost-effective commerce while ensuring that environmental protection remains at the highest levels for our ports, in our waterways, and our harbors. So, Mr. President, we have been trying, we've been working for months, and I really want to commend my friend from Pennsylvania, Senator Casey, as we tried to accommodate the concerns of many, many other senators. So we've changed this part of the Coast Guard bill numerous times to try to address these. I think we've gotten almost every senator on board, with the exception of just a few. But notably, one of the things that, again, we have strong bipartisan support for in this bill and would help a number of my constituents, thousands in the fishing industry, is that this provision that we've agreed on provides a permanent exemption on incidental vessel discharges for all fishing vessels and small commercial vessels. Right now, believe it or not, if you have a small commercial vessel and you're gutting fish that you've caught on the vessel and you want to hose down the guts of those fish back into the water, you need a permit from the EPA. Think about that. Think about a regulation that's going to hurt small businesses. So what we are trying to do, Mr. President, is encourage all of our colleagues to help us move forward, A, with the Coast Guard bill. We moved the National Defense Authorization Act that covers the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines every year. Well, we should be moving the Coast Guard bill every year as well to make sure that we are taking care of the men and women in the Coast Guard, that we're not forgetting the fifth branch of service in the military that does so much for our men and women. But we also need solutions to this issue of the vessel incidental discharge challenges, and we need to get this provision of the Coast Guard bill unstuck. So I, again, want to thank my colleagues for being on the floor with me. And again, this is a very bipartisan issue, but we wanted to call out the importance of this issue to our colleagues in the Senate to say it's time to act. It's time to move on the Coast Guard bill. It's time to conclude this very important VITA provision, and I'm hopeful that we can do that soon. Mr. President, I'm now going to yield my time to my friend from Pennsylvania, Senator Casey.
Mr. President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to start by commending the work of Senator Sullivan from Alaska and for his words today to move this legislation forward, and for his work and the work of his staff over many, many months now. I want to thank our staff as well, and the staff of Senator Wicker and so many other offices that I won't have an opportunity to name, but we're especially grateful for that bipartisan effort, which every once in a while works around here. And I'm grateful that he and his team, Senator Sullivan and his team, have put in the kind of time they have. This legislation is part of the broader Coast Guard legislation, the Commercial Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, so-called VITA Act, is critically important to get done this year. As Senator Sullivan mentioned, there's bipartisan support, and we should pass it immediately. When I introduced this legislation back in January of last year, working with Senator Wicker, Senator Sullivan, and others, it was included in the larger Coast Guard Authorization Act. That was passed by the Senate Commerce, Science, Transportation Committee in May of 2017. Since that time, we've conducted extensive negotiations with our colleagues, and that might be an understatement, to address important concerns, environmental concerns, as well as enforcement concerns. This legislation fulfills at least two priorities for Pennsylvania. First, it allows us to be in the position to enact strong environmental protection standards for our waterways in Pennsylvania, and second, supporting our maritime industry. Currently, vessel owners and operators are forced to comply with a patchwork of overly burdensome and confusing federal and state regulations for vessel ballast water and incidental discharges. This act, the C-VIDA, V-I-D-A, the C-VIDA Act would establish uniform national standards and requirements governing ballast water discharges and other discharges that occur during normal operation of vessels. C-VIDA would provide the maritime industry with a consistent, uniform regulatory structure while ensuring that there are environmental protections in place to protect our nation's ports and waterways. The national standard in C-VIDA ensures that vessels with the best on-board environmental equipment are calling at our ports. That's critical for Pennsylvania, which has coastal, inland, and Great Lakes vessel traffic. There have been concerns raised about the environmental protections, as I mentioned, in the Act, and the lack of involvement of the EPA and the states in developing and enforcing these protections. Once again, I want to commend the work of the staff. Staff from several Senate offices have worked very hard to address these concerns and to ensure that the EPA is involved and that C-VIDA has strong environmental standards and that we update and revisit these environmental standards as science evolves. Both ballast water and incidental discharge rules will be developed with the Coast Guard in concurrence with the EPA and in consultation with the states. State-specific incidental discharge standards would remain in place until new federal regulations are enforced. The original bill eliminated state standards upon the enactment of legislation. Additionally, states would have co-enforcement of these standards with the Coast Guard. If a state believes that there should be a more stringent national standard, then the state can submit a petition to the Coast Guard. And if that standard is found to be technologically and economically viable, the state standards will become the new national standard. Senators in both parties have been working in good faith, and as you can see, have made substantial changes to the original legislation. Mr. President, we have an opportunity to pass an important bill that vessel owners, operators, and maritime labor all agree on. The maritime industry is exactly at the point where we would want other industry sectors to be, developing good business in a clean environment. They have asked the Senate to enact a long-term regulatory framework, and we shouldn't let this opportunity slip by. So, Mr. President, I want to turn the microphone over to Senator Wicker, and as I said earlier, grateful to be working with Senator Wicker all these many months and our staffs, as well as, of course, Senator Sullivan and all those involved. So I yield the floor.
Well, I thank my friend from Pennsylvania and would observe, Mr. President, that he has exercised excellent leadership in this issue. It's a very important issue. It's not at the top of the news media's treatment of what we need to do, but it is an important issue, and it's one that we are close to being able to resolve in a bipartisan way. And I also want to thank my colleague from Alaska, who has been a champion for this issue. And just to make a couple of points that would underscore what my friends have just said. We're talking about ballast water in the waters of the United States. And some of it gets out. You let some ballast water in and you have to let some out. And it's incidental to operating a boat in the waters of the United States of America. We want this water to be clean. We want it to be as environmentally pure as possible, and that's what this bill attempts to do, but it attempts to do it on a uniform basis rather than having a patchwork of regulations from state to state and area to area, it would give us one strict national standard as far as the incidental discharge of this ballast water. The water that gets out into our lakes and rivers needs to be safe for the environment. It needs to be safe for fish in our American waters. It needs to be safe for marine plant life. And so what this would do is put the EPA involved in writing the regulations and determining what is safe for American waters. And so EPA would sort of be the scientific guide there. And then the Coast Guard would be part of the enforcement. EPA has readily said we're not able to be in the enforcement business in the waters of the United States. So they're going to help with the science, according to this new proposal, and the Coast Guard is going to help with the enforcement. Who's for this? 300 businesses, labor unions, ports, terminal operators. They're all in it together, and they all say this would work. This is not an example of one side getting up some numbers on a partisan basis and deciding to try to run over the others. As a matter of fact, this is such a bipartisan idea, Mr. President, that we have over 60 senators in favor of this proposal. I just want to assure anyone who has doubts about this that the EPA is going to sign off on these standards. They're going to sign off on standards that are safe, but we're really doing this for jobs and commerce in the United States of America. Imagine if you're in the business, if you're in the barge business, or if you're in the commercial maritime business anywhere in the United States, and you have to worry about compliance from state to state. And maybe it might just be a reporting requirement. Clearly, this is a burden on people that want to do the right thing, but simply would like to have one standard nationwide to comply with, and that's what we're trying to do. We're close, and I would simply say to my friend from Alaska, who's done more work on this really than anybody in my memory, I would observe to the senator, I think we're close to being able to do this on a bipartisan basis, and perhaps putting this as an attachment to a must-pass piece of legislation. I think we could do it because we've demonstrated through our friend in Pennsylvania and other Democrats and Republicans that we have been careful to include everyone and to be bipartisan about it. Would my friend agree that we really are at a point where this really needs to be signed into law?
Well, absolutely. And I want to thank Senator Wicker for his leadership on this issue. And I think what you're seeing here in this colloquy is the strength of the bipartisan support for this bill, not only in the Senate, but throughout the country. And I appreciate my colleagues' words about who's supporting. But it is, Mr. President, a very, very broad-based coalition. Fishing vessels, passenger vessels, labor unions, the Navy League of the United States, marine terminals, port authorities. And I think both Senator Wicker and Senator Casey made a really strong point. This is going to keep the highest standards on the environment for our waters. This isn't about cutting corners, but it's going to make these standards uniform, which is what our nation needs. And what we also need to do is make sure that we are passing the Coast Guard bill as well as this important component of it. The men and women of the Coast Guard are serving our nation just like the other members of the military, and somehow by delaying this bill, we're undermining their longer-term interests. I think the Senate can do a much better job, but I agree with my colleague from Mississippi that we're close. There's clearly bipartisan support across the board for the VITA Act and the Coast Guard bill, and we're hopeful that within the next few weeks or few months, we're going to get this done, and it's going to benefit literally every state in this great nation of ours.
I thank my friend from Alaska for once again segueing to the larger issue there. Vessel incidental discharge is a very important part, but only a part of the Coast Guard authorization, and the gentleman, the senator from Alaska, makes the very valid point that we really need to get to a situation where we're taking up the Coast Guard reauthorization on a regular basis, because it's a very vital part of our national security. You know, the Coast Guard is actually one of those domestic discretionary programs that provides us with a great deal of national security. But Coast Guard currently operates ships in its high-endurance cutter fleet that are more than 45 years old. We need some reforms in the Coast Guard. The Senate and the House need to pay attention to the reauthorization on a very regular basis. And so the larger issue is absolutely well taken on the part of the senator from Alaska. And I just would once again say that my friend, the senator from Alaska, has exercised excellent leadership. He's been relentless on the Coast Guard reauthorization, and particularly the vessel incidental discharge. And he and others who fought so hard really deserve some results, because there are no substantive objections that can be raised at this point.
Well, I want to thank my colleague from Mississippi for his strong leadership on this issue as well. And I think you're seeing here, Mr. President, with Democrats and Republicans pretty much all united on this issue. We're hopeful to move not only the VITA Act, but the broader Coast Guard bill here out of the Senate, get it passed, get it to the President's desk. That's going to be good for the men and women on the Coast Guard. It's going to be good for our maritime and fishing interests, and it's going to be good for the country. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I rise today in opposition to the massive spending increases included in the proposed budget measure. To propose increasing federal spending by nearly $300 billion over the next 2 years, on top of the spending increases already established, is simply beyond comprehension. This is all with a national debt of $20 trillion a year. Current deficits running $600 to $700 billion. Yet we're about to vote on a bill to abandon self-imposed limits on federal spending. And anybody who's spent time in Washington will know that once you've raised spending limits, you just don't get them back down. Now, I love bipartisanship, but not when it's bought and paid for with billions of taxpayer dollars. That's precisely what this measure does. You sprinkle enough money around, you can get bipartisan support. While I was in the House for 12 years, I kept a journal of events And in December of 2007, when we passed a massive omnibus bill at that time, I noted, and I'll quote from my journal, "The Democrats singled out the funding for the Iraq War, which required a separate vote. The tally board on the House chamber wall explaining the vote said the following: agreeing to the House amendment, to the Senate amendment, to the House amendment." I said at that time, well, that clears it up. But that's the point. Liberal Democrats could vote against the war funding and for more domestic funding. Conservative Republicans could do the opposite. Enough moderates in the middle would vote for both pieces of legislation to ensure that each passed separately. I continued, then we could, all of us, Republicans and Democrats, beat our collective chests and go home for Christmas. Bipartisanship at its best. I wrote further in my journal at that time, all these shenanigans led one Republican colleague to lean over to me on the House floor and muse, "You know, Jeff, sometimes the toughest thing about being a member of Congress is remembering everything you're supposed to be outraged about." And I agreed. But here we are today, and it is clear what we should be outraged about: a $300 billion spending hike, a return to trillion-dollar deficits, and an apparent end to any attempt to rein in federal spending. Our fiscal responsibility is more than a political talking point to trot out when the other guys are in charge. The rules and principles do not change with the legislative session. It should not take hundreds of billions of dollars in government spending to prompt bipartisanship or to secure a budget agreement. If we Republicans support precisely the kind of reckless spending that we've for so long criticized, it will mean an end of genuine fiscal conservatism in Washington, and it will establish a government without any meaningful spending restraints. I urge my colleagues to consider their commitment to conservatism and whether or not the past protests over government spending were anything more than convenient political props. Let's be conservative no matter who's in charge, no matter who's in the White House or who controls each chamber in Congress. With that, I yield the floor.
President.
Assistant Democratic Leader.
Are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today, as I have over the past few months, urging the United States Senate to come together in a bipartisan fashion to address important issues facing our nation. The American people expect it. They understand how closely divided we are, 49 Democrats, 51 Republicans in the Senate, and for the most controversial issues, 60 votes are required. Unless we work in a bipartisan fashion, we achieve little or nothing. After many months of difficult negotiation, I stand here today in support of a bipartisan two-year budget agreement announced by leaders McConnell and Schumer that will finally produce results for the American people. For too long, this gridlocked Congress has lurched from one continuing resolution, that's a temporary spending bill, to another. That's prevented us from working together to craft appropriations bills that save taxpayers money, that invest in things that are important at every level for our future. While this budget deal doesn't include everything that I'd like to see, it certainly includes some highlights of things that I think are critically important for the state of Illinois and our nation. I'm particularly disappointed that it does not include a solution to the Daca dreamer crisis that was created by President Trump on September 5th when he announced that he would eliminate the program that provides protection from deportation for almost 800,000 people in the United States. That's over 5 months ago. President Trump challenged this Congress, challenged this Senate to come up with a legislative solution. As I stand here today, we have not produced it. I will certainly acknowledge that Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, together with Senator Schumer, the Democratic leader, have charted a course for us next week. We're going to do something in the Senate you haven't seen in a long time. We're going to come to the floor of the Senate and act like senators. For some of my colleagues, it'll be their first-time experience. A bill on the floor, open to amendment, actual debate. Yes, it's going to happen right here. Stay tuned on C-SPAN. Next week could be historic. It's been over a year and a half since we've had a meaningful debate on the floor, but next week we will. And the topic, immigration and Daca. We know that we have to. The March 5th deadline is looming when this program will end by President Trump's prohibition of the program. And at that point, 1,000 young people each day, on average, will lose their protection from deportation and their legal right to work in America. They will walk off the job because we failed to act unless we get it together. I'm sorry that this bill that includes so many good things doesn't include that solution, but we are poised to do it anyway, and I look forward to that debate next week. I hope that this agreement will provide a spirit of bipartisanship that will be felt next week when we come together and discuss the fates of hundreds of thousands of dreamers across the United States. Let me tell you what this budget agreement does, which I think is well worth our bipartisan support. A huge investment for America's military. We will prepare our men and women in uniform to be not only ready for battle, but to continue to be the strongest and best military in the world. That is something that we have seen go by the boards and, frankly, be ignored in the past, but now we're going to focus on it. I have the greatest confidence in General Mattis in terms of his commitment to our military, both in his personal life and in his new role as Secretary of Defense. I believe that he will direct the spending appropriately so that we can prepare our men and women for battle and prepare our nation to defend itself under any threat, and if necessary, to use our force for good around the world. But we also make a dramatic investment in non-defense spending. In the past 8 or 10 years, we have seen a dramatic downturn in non-defense spending in our budget. Many people have said nobody will notice. Well, America noticed as we cut back our investment in education, in health care, and so many fundamentals. There's one particular area I want to highlight. When I had to make a decision as to whether to run for another term in the Senate, I sat down and made a very short list of things that I wanted to accomplish or work on if I were given another 6-year term. Near the top of that list, of course, were the Dreamers, but second was medical research. I came back here and sat down with my colleagues, 2 Republicans, Senators Alexander and Blunt, and my wonderful friend and colleague in leadership, Senator Patty Murray. And I said, we need to do something. Dr. Collins at the National Institutes of Health had told me that the problem with medical research is if it's not certain that next year you'll receive a grant to continue your medical research, you get discouraged. You start looking for another job. We can't let that happen. We can't lose the best and brightest who are searching for cures to diseases which haunt and plague many families across America. Dr. Collins suggested 5% real growth in the budget of the National Institutes of Health. And I want to salute especially my colleagues, Senator Blunt, a Republican, Senator Murray, a Democrat. They really made good on that promise. We worked together and they delivered. This will be the 3rd straight year we've had more than 5% increase in medical research. If there's ever an issue that's bipartisan, it should be this one. The good news is this budget agreement will go beyond 5%. We're talking in the area of 7 or 8% real increases in spending for medical research. Dr. Collins told me years ago when he talked about this goal that if we could provide this kind of reliable increase in medical research, dramatic breakthroughs would occur. We're starting to see them. Some of the cancer therapies that are curing cancers today were unthinkable just a few years ago, and there's more to follow. Think about all the news reports now about flu and what it's doing to children, some of whom tragically have lost their lives, many of whom stayed home from school, and others around our nation and the world plagued by influenza each year. At this moment, NIH is working on a universal flu vaccine. If it is discovered, it will be a lifesaver. It will change the basic life pattern that many of us have faced our entire lives. It can happen. I can remember, I'm old enough to remember, when Dr. Jonas Salk came up with the polio vaccine. And that was a breakthrough that many of us never imagined. It can happen. This budget will help it happen. And that's why I'm so happy to see. I also want to say that they've done a great job in providing resources to fight the opioid crisis, the worst drug epidemic in the history, addiction epidemic in the history of our nation. Funding our community health centers, a critical part of public health, and making certain that basic primary care is available to every American. Health care for our children through the CHIP program. Improving our veterans' health facilities. We'll be investing for the first time in years billions of dollars in new veteran health care facilities, some of it long overdue. And we're going to help fix our nation's aged and broken infrastructure. It provides resources and funding for Florida, Texas, California, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. There are many people from Puerto Rico who live in the city of Chicago. Some of them are extremely close friends. I am happy to report that this bill makes the investment we need to make to get that island back on its feet. $2 billion to put into electrical infrastructure in and of itself can bring Puerto Rico back and restore electrical service to the families that have been waiting months for what each of us take for granted each and every day. This disaster relief will make a difference in their lives. How did we achieve this amazing outcome where Democrats and Republicans would come to the floor and praise it? Well, we sat down and made a compromise. We gave on both sides, and we realized that it was time to roll up our sleeves, stop squabbling, stop fighting for headlines, stop putting out press releases, and get down to work. I hope next week that spirit continues when we enter the debate on immigration and Daca. It's my sincere hope that we will have a bipartisan breakthrough on immigration next week, not just for the Dreamers and their families, but for the good of the future of America. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from South Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. To begin with, I have 6 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate, they have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, I come here today to offer my support for the Bipartisan Budget Act, which we expect to vote on later today. This bipartisan agreement includes a number of priorities that will benefit Americans, including $20 billion in new investment in infrastructure over the next 2 years, $6 billion to combat the opioid epidemic, disaster relief assistance for those impacted by recent hurricanes, funding for community health centers, a permanent repeal of Obamacare's Independent Payment Advisory Board, or IPAB, and the creation of 2 select committees to address pension reform and Congress's broken budget process. Most importantly, Mr. President, is that this bipartisan agreement removes the arbitrary spending caps that have hampered our armed forces. For the first time in years, we prioritize our national security by adequately funding the military. Of all the positive aspects of this agreement that will benefit the people of my home state of South Dakota and American families across the country, the addition of $165 billion in defense funding over the next 2 years is crucial. As a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, I have been deeply concerned about the underfunding of our military. If we are going to adequately recover readiness levels that were lost over the last 8 years, as well as modernize our armed forces in this increasingly dangerous and complex world, adequately funding our troops is vital. This is the reason that I support the Bipartisan Budget Act. I have previously expressed my strong displeasure for short-term funding measures, or CRs, but this agreement makes significant progress towards rebuilding our military and finally, after years of underfunding, provides the Department of Defense with a much-needed spending boost. This will provide the resources to adequately train and rebuild the armed forces at a time of increasing global threats. But don't just take my word for it. Let me quote the Defense Secretary James Mattis, who testified before the House Armed Services Committee earlier this week. He said, and I quote, "Let me be clear. As hard as the last 16 years of war have been in our military, no enemy in the field has done as much to harm the readiness of the United States military than the combined impact of the Budget Control Act's defense spending caps, worsened by operating for 10 of the last 11 years under continuing resolutions of varied and unpredictable duration." Secretary Mattis went on to tell the committee that the consequences of not providing a budget are clear. Should we stumble into a year-long continuing resolution, your military will not be able to provide pay for our troops by the end of the fiscal year, will not recruit the 15,000 Army soldiers and 4,000 Air Force airmen required to fill critical manning shortfalls. We will not maintain our ships at sea with the proper balance between operations and time in port for maintenance. We will ground aircraft due to lack of maintenance and spare parts. We will deplete the ammunition, training, and manpower required to deter war, and delay contracts for vital acquisition programs necessary to modernize the force. End of quote. Mr. President, sadly, we are hearing in the Senate Armed Services Committee many of the Secretary's predictions are already proving true. Earlier this week, I spoke on this floor about this very issue and described various readiness issues that our armed forces are currently facing. Some examples that I shared include the FA-18 fleet taking twice as many man-hours to maintain, with less than 50% of the fleet available. Those are the primary aircraft that you will see flying off of our carriers in harm's way today. The maintenance backlog of our submarines. Because of the backlog, 15 nuclear-attacked submarines have been docked for a total of 177 months, or nearly 15 years. That doesn't mean they're being repaired. It means they're sitting at dock because they're not even licensed to dive anymore. What a waste of taxpayer money. The tragic human cost found in the lack of readiness, as FA-18 Hornet training programs have had dozens of mishaps over the past several years, some leading to loss of life. We believe some, if not all, of these mishaps could have been avoided with the additional training and maintenance that would have been forthcoming with appropriate funding. Mr. President, the American people expect us to adequately fund the defense of America next year and every year to come. Providing for the defense of our nation is the #1 responsibility of the federal government and of this Congress. Nothing else matters if we cannot protect ourselves from our enemies. I am pleased this agreement finally recognizes the need to eliminate arbitrary budget caps that have put our national security in jeopardy. The Bipartisan Budget Act is truly bipartisan. There are parts in this that I most certainly very strongly agree with, and there are some areas that I would have done differently. But this is a bipartisan agreement and must meet the standards of both Republicans and Democrats. While I would have preferred to see an increase in defense funding without having to pair it with other spending increases, because we need a bipartisan majority of 60 senators to agree to this proposal, we reluctantly accept the increased spending on non-defense discretionary programs in order to achieve the very necessary and critical increases in our defense appropriations. Perhaps one of the more important aspects of this agreement is that for the first time since the Budget Control Act of 2011, we are able to overcome the demands of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to match defense spending and non-defense spending on a dollar-for-dollar basis. Under this agreement, defense spending will receive a larger increase than discretionary funding, $165 billion for defense over the next 2 years, as compared to $131 billion for non-defense discretionary over the next 2 years. I would have preferred not to raise discretionary spending to this level, but not having achieved a path forward without the higher defense limits was simply not an option. We must still be diligent in addressing our nation's debt crisis, and we have already begun to take the steps to do so. Just a couple months ago, we passed historic tax reform that is already helping to unleash the full potential of our economy, thereby bringing in much-needed additional revenues. We've also been working with President Trump and the administration to reduce burdensome regulations and streamline federal programs so we can save taxpayer money by making the government more efficient. These are positive things that will help to control our debt. However, the most important thing we must do to rein in spending is to control the skyrocketing cost of mandatory payment programs, Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. In fact, prior to our tax relief plan, we were warned that without taking action to properly manage these programs, by the year 2026, when our country turns 250 years old, spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security and servicing the national debt would take up 99% of all the federal revenues generated. Today, mandatory payments already account for nearly 3/4 of our total federal spending. This is because Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security have never been properly managed, and Congress does not exercise appropriate oversight. These programs run on autopilot. Given that they are our largest federal expenditures every year, it is vital that Congress take an active role in managing these necessary, and I'll say that again, these necessary mandatory programs in order to get our fiscal house in order. This does not necessarily mean making cuts. It simply means giving Congress the authority to periodically and consistently review them to make them as efficient as possible and to make certain they are available for individuals who need them, both now and in the future. I'm pleased that this agreement creates a joint select committee to address ways to fix our broken budget process, which is desperately needed. At the end of the day, no amounts of cuts to defense and other programs will have a meaningful effect on debt reduction without also controlling the cost of these necessary mandatory payment programs. Mr. President, I will wrap up by thanking my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who support this agreement for recognizing our country's need to adequately fund our troops who sacrifice everything to protect our freedoms. Without a strong military which can deter and defend against aggression, nothing else really matters. Maintaining the best, strongest military force in the world is vital to keeping Americans safe. By increasing funding now, our troops will be better equipped to just exactly that. We cannot risk a perceived weakness in our force by our enemies, who may wish to draw us into a major conflict. A major conflict of war, or a major conflict or war, is not only significantly more costly in terms of dollars, it has the more serious cost of the loss of human life. No one wants to see that, especially if we can avoid it now. This agreement adequately funds our troops. I intend to vote for it, and I encourage my colleagues to do so as well. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Vermont.
President, I'll be brief, but I'll speak basically in my capacity as Vice Chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. You know, there are things here that can be exciting to talk about. Some things seem kind of dry. But when we talk about the budget, the consequences affect every single one of us, every single state, and multi-generations. The consequences of the Budget Control Act sequestration cuts since 2011 have been devastating. They're going to last for generations. The impact on military readiness led Defense Secretary Mattis to say that no enemy on the field has done more harm to our military than what we've done to ourselves through sequestration. And by not investing in our domestic priorities, we allowed our infrastructure to crumble, care to our veterans to be delayed, and investments in education to fall behind. I say this as a preface to the fact that the bipartisan budget deal announced yesterday by Senator McConnell and Senator Schumer is the first step toward providing much-needed relief from sequestration and stability in the appropriations process. I followed very carefully what they've been doing. My staff, especially the Appropriations Committee, has been very much involved. And what we see in it, our defense caps increased $80 billion in fiscal year 2018, $85 billion in fiscal year 2019. Non-defense caps are increased by $63 billion above the caps in fiscal year 2018, and $68 billion above the caps in fiscal year 2019. Those are numbers. Let's look at a couple of things it means. This bipartisan deal that we've worked out, and I stress it is bipartisan, advances our priorities. It guarantees that we can make real investments in addressing the opioid crisis. We can all give speeches about the opioid crisis. Speeches don't solve the problems. Actually, putting money in there does. It lets us fund medical research. Keep in mind, Mr. President, you can't turn medical research on and off. You can't say, oh, you're making great steps in cancer research, but stop it for a few years and then we'll come back with money. You have to continue it. It's also going to improve college affordability. Everywhere I go in Vermont, I hear young people saying, will I ever be able to buy a house? Because I've had to put so much money and borrow so much money for college. And I'm particularly pleased the bill includes an important provision I worked on with my colleague and the chairman, Senator Cochran, that's going to improve assistance to our nation's dairy and cotton farmers. In Vermont and across the country, it's going to mean immediate relief for struggling dairy farmers who can't wait for the next farm bill for assistance. We'll work on these problems in the next farm bill, but in the meantime, until that farm bill comes, we need some immediate assistance. And this deal finally fulfills our promise to communities recovering from recent natural disasters, from wildfires out west to the shores of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Texas, and Florida, by providing $89 billion to help them rebuild. Those states in the West, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Texas, and Florida, were all part of the United States, just as Vermont sought help. When we were hit just a few years ago by a natural disaster, and others came to our aid, people I talked with in Vermont say, of course, we help others in our country. But it also the agreement provides continued funding for several health care programs that Congress has allowed to expire. We include long overdue funding for community health centers. They've been struggling because of the uncertainty of continued funding for months. Can we expand? Do we have to lay off people? Can we take further steps or not? Now they will have some certainty. And I'm pleased this deal finally extends tax provisions, many of which lapsed in 2016. They're going to benefit individuals and small businesses. Now, everything I wanted was not included in this deal. Actually, everything everybody wanted. I see my friend from Texas, a member of the leadership, not everything he wanted is in here. But that's why you have a compromise. Not everybody doesn't get everything they want, but we're a lot better off than we were. I worry about the fact it does not provide protection for our nation's dreamers. These are law-abiding strivers who call America home. They seek nothing more than to contribute to our society. Individuals like Dr. Juan Conde of Vermont, he came to the United States as a child, and he's studying to treat cancer patients at the Lerner College of Medicine at the University of Vermont. Do we tell him to leave? A man who might be part of those who find a cure for cancer. I wrote a letter to the editor recently to a newspaper in Vermont. They had talked about the stone carvers in Vermont. I talked about one stone carver. My maternal grandfather immigrated from Italy to Vermont. He was a master stone carver from the Friuli region near Aviano Air Base in northern Italy, and talked about the business he started. My mother then born in South Reigate, Vermont, and what he did. My great-grandparents who came to central Vermont from Ireland, paternal grandparents, and my grandfather, for whom I'm named Patrick Leahy, was also a stone carver. I never knew him because, like so many, he died of silicosis of the lungs when my father was a young teenager. I'm proud to be named after him. My wife, Marcelle, her parents emigrated from Canada. She was born in Vermont, became a medical surgical nurse. Now, everybody in these families added and improved our state of Vermont. We must realize it's immigrants like this that bring diversity and strengths and skills to our country and make us greater. So when we talk about the dreamers, we shouldn't forsake their cause. Their cause is our cause. Their dreams are part of the American dreams that my grandparents were and my parents-in-law were. Those are dreams, are part of our American dream. So we have to continue to get legislation passed to protect them. As I said, the agreement does not contain everything I'd like. Very little that I've seen in legislation does contain everything I want. But on balance, it contains a lot and is a good bill for the American people. It allows us to complete the 2018 appropriations process. And through what we call regular order, we can have a real debate in the fiscal year 2019 bills. We'll start working on those next week. So I thank Senator McConnell and I thank Senator Schumer for their hard work in coming to this agreement. I work almost daily with both of them. I know how hard it was. Compromise is not always easy. Often is not popular. Well, Nobody came here thinking everything is going to be easy, and if they do, they don't belong in the United States Senate. Should be here to be a legislator. And I encourage all senators, help us pass this bipartisan deal. Allow the Senate Appropriations Committee to resume its work, and we will next week. And I hope the House will do the same before tonight's midnight deadline. And I'll continue, as I have, working with my friend, Chairman Cochran, in the coming weeks, as I will with all Republicans and all Democrats on the Senate Appropriations Committee. This agreement will finally let us do the job we're supposed to. And Mr. President, I will yield the floor, but I'd ask consent my full statement be part of the record.
Without objection.
Suggest I see the senator from Texas on his feet. I yield to him.
Mr. President.
The majority whip.
Mr. President, I want to express my gratitude to my friend from Vermont for his service on the Appropriations Committee and working with us specifically on this particular legislation as it relates to the disaster relief aspect of it. Obviously, my state was devastated by Hurricane Harvey, but I must tell my friend I've got new empathy and understanding for how bound we are together as the multiple states. What happens in one part of the country should be of concern to those of us in other parts of the country, because eventually, sooner or later, disasters are going to visit all of us. But it is good news that the Majority Leader was able to announce yesterday that we've reached a compromise on government funding through not just the end of this fiscal year, but next year as well. This agreement ensures that our armed forces will finally have the resources they need. My colleague and fellow Texan Mac Thornberry, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, along with the senior senator from Arizona, Senator McCain, said it best. They said this budget agreement is indispensable for our national security. Without it, our military would not be able to defend our nation. Period. Hard stop. Let me repeat that. This budget agreement is indispensable for our national security. Without it, our military would not be able to defend our nation. I think of all the demands made on the taxpayer dollar that is sent here to Washington, D.C., and many of them have a lot of merit, some more than others. But I have to say that if you were going to ask me to prioritize how do we appropriate money here in Washington, D.C., national security would be job number one. In addition, the funding bill will provide support for our veterans, those who have worn the uniform but now left the military service, as well as their families. And it will clear way for new investment in our nation's infrastructure. I'm grateful to the Majority Leader for his hard work during this series of long and delicate negotiations. We all know that it could not have been easy. But even more than that, I'm glad, as I indicated at the outset, that the funding package finally sends disaster relief to Texas, disaster relief that had been long promised but had been delayed time and time again. Today, the Senate will be considering supplemental appropriation for disaster aid that affects the victims of Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Harvey, as well as the wildfires and mudslides out west. But last August, Hurricane Harvey made its landfall near Houston along the Gulf Coast. And when that storm hit, communities like Port Arthur, Beaumont, Rockport, and Victoria were crippled. Not to mention Houston, where most of the major media covered, one of the largest cities in the United States. The Hurricane Center's official report released last month confirmed that those that lived through the storm, what they had already guessed. It was the most significant rainfall event in the United States. During a period of about 5 days, the skies opened up and dropped 50 inches of rain. 50 inches of rain. The report called Harvey unprecedented and truly overwhelming. As someone who witnessed the devastation firsthand, I can say with certainty that those are not exaggerations. It was an event that happens perhaps once every 1,000 years. At least 88 people lost their lives. Many more crashed their vehicles, were electrocuted, were unable to receive medical services, and could not attend school and missed work. They spent this fall tearing the sheetrock out of their homes or their businesses. Since the time of the storm, Congress has appropriated roughly $35 billion in federal aid through 2 separate emergency bills. Working closely with the Majority Leader, my Texas colleagues and I were able to increase the first disaster relief bill last fall by adding money for community development block grants. This ensured a larger down payment to Texas to rebuild and repair, and I thank goodness we were able to get that money then, because of the delays we've seen up until today in additional disaster relief for Hurricane Harvey. But once that money was appropriated, we worked with Dr. Carson, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, to accelerate the allocation of these funds, which he graciously did. Congress followed up by passing a tax relief bill for individuals and small businesses that sustained financial hardships as a result of the hurricane. And then finally, we worked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to identify and prioritize key projects for coastal protection to mitigate the impact of future storms. This is not the last hurricane that will hit the coast of Texas or Florida. So we need to prepare for the future as well. But in spite of that work, tremendous challenges remain. That's why we kept fighting month after month, and today marks the culmination of our efforts. The supplemental appropriations bill we'll consider today includes $89 billion in disaster relief, $8 billion more than the House passed last December. It ensures that Texas will have increased access to the pool of community development block grant dollars, and it provides funding and flexibility to ensure that the Army Corps of Engineers are able to carry out necessary projects in the state. It includes funding to help Texas address lingering transportation issues resulting from Hurricane Harvey and allow us to move forward on flood mitigation projects like the Sabine Pass to Galveston Bay. Finally, it includes a provision, this is important to the agriculture community in my state, a provision to make cotton an eligible commodity under the Farm Bill safety net. That's really good news for the folks in West Texas, the largest cotton growing area and the largest cotton growing state in the nation, and they've been waiting a long time. Some of them lost bales of cotton or even entire gins because of all the water that they sustained as a result of the storms. I applaud the Texas congressional delegation for taking the first step and passing a disaster supplemental appropriation last year. And I appreciate Governor Abbott and the Senate Appropriations Committee, including Senator Leahy, for working with us to strengthen the bill here in the Senate over the last month or so. Helping Texans recover and rebuild has been my top priority, and I'm now urging my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in both houses to pass this critical relief bill as soon as possible. I want to thank Chairman Cochran, the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, for his leadership steering the Appropriations Committee, which has its work cut out for them and has certainly done yeoman's work to date. I want to thank the junior senator from Florida and my other colleagues, particularly Senator Cruz, my colleague here in the Senate, who have fought with us side by side for relief from the numerous disasters that have affected Florida, Texas, the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and of course the wildfires and mudslides out west. Mr. President, on a separate and unrelated note, I'd like to recognize the passing of retired Lieutenant General Daniel James III. He served as the first African-American Adjutant General for my home state, as well as the first African-American Director of the Air National Guard. He was the son of Daniel Chappie James, Jr., a fighter pilot who was the first African-American Air Force general to pin on 4 stars. A highly decorated command pilot with approximately 4,000 flying hours, many of those in combat, General James completed 2 active duty tours in Southeast Asia, and he was also inducted into the Texas Military Forces Hall of Fame. And since his burial is taking place today in Arlington National Cemetery, I'd just like to let all those in attendance know that I'm thinking of them. I know James was a mentor to my friend General Nichols, the current Adjutant General, but he was a role model for us all. Finally, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that Ramona McGee, a Department of Homeland Security fellow in my office, have privileges of the floor during the consideration of border security and immigration legislation. And I'd also ask unanimous consent for my military fellow, Patrick Heine, to have privileges of the floor for the remainder of this year.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.